NBC News World Headquarters in New York. This is NBC Nightly News with Brian Williams.
Good evening. For the new president, aside from keeping all of us safe, it is job one. In fact, the U.S. economy is in rough shape. It's been theorized early on here. It's the one issue that could consume the presidency of Barack Obama.
In 2008, the worst recession since the 1920s hit the USA and subsequently the rest of the world. The UK and US reacted differently, America choosing to inject a stimulus package into the economy, and the UK choosing to use austerity measures to tackle debt. Both countries are now making good progress with economic growth and are well on the way to getting back to pre-2008 levels. In this film, I'm going to talk to economics experts and a politician to explore social and cultural aspects as well as pure economics, to try and reach a conclusion on whether this crisis was dealt with well by both countries.
I think unifies this group is a recognition that we are experiencing a unprecedented, perhaps, economic crisis that has to be dealt with and dealt with rapidly.
I'm starting my research at school with my economics teacher, Mr. Rhodes, to try and find out what exactly caused the credit crunch in 2008 and to learn the basics about austerity and stimulus.
What we're going to focus in on is what became known as the credit crunch. And that generally means that suddenly, within the financial sector, there was a sudden shortage of funds available. And very much the start of it was in the US, with mortgage lenders over-exploiting what became known as the subprime lending market. Sub meaning beneath, prime meaning the best. So these were customers, these were homeowners that were borrowing money and allowed to borrow huge amounts of money that they never should have done. So what we had were groups of customers who had borrowed huge amounts of money, 100% plus mortgages, on initial very low rates of interest. We're coming out of that period, so we're paying more regular market rates of interest that at the same time were being increased by the US government as part of their anti-inflationary monetary policy. So inevitably what was going to happen was that these mortgage holders were going to default. And unfortunately, normally what happens when somebody defaults on a loan is that the mortgage company or the bank that has granted that loan then repossesses the house. But what happened at the same time was that the US economy went into slowdown, house prices fell, so the values of the property when sold were not enough to pay off the loans. So you had mortgage companies suffering default, you had banks that had provided the finance suffering huge hits, huge losses, and they had to write off huge amounts of money in order to cover themselves. And that inevitably, once you've had your fingers majorly burnt, then makes you think hugely a second time around as to whether I'm going to lend money. And it suddenly became apparent that in the USA, it then became very, very difficult to borrow money to raise funds. Why is that a problem? Well, because the business world relies upon credit. If the business world cannot obtain credit, they cannot expand, they cannot cover their overdrafts, they cannot sort out their cash flow problems. So problems in the financial markets then caused problems in what we call the real economy in terms of businesses producing goods and services. And that kicked off an almighty recession in the US, which very quickly, because of all the links that Europe and the rest of the world has with the US, became recessions in Europe, in the UK and in the rest of the world. You know, economics very generally can be divided into what we might call supply side or free market economists who believe in the power of free markets and therefore trying to reduce the power of the state. And on the other side, you had another group of economists perhaps taking their their theories from the works of John Maynard Keynes, who believe that the government have a role to play by getting into an economy and stimulating economy. So between those two camps, you had the one group, the supply side free market economists, that saw the way to solve the problems as being austerity, cutting back on public spending, slashing government budgets, rolling back the state, trying to clear the national debt. And on the other side, you had people who were in favour of the government taking a major role and actually being part of aggregate demand and increasing government spending and in some ways trying to spend your way out of a recession. And it's those two options that I think we're now going to look at.
On the 17th of February 2009, the American Recovery and Reinvestment Act was enacted by Congress. This legislation laid out plans for $831 billion to be invested by the US government between 2009 and 2019.
And the president said today his $25 billion stimulus package is on track to be passed by mid-February.
In theory, stimulus works by boosting the economy and igniting a multiplying factor, where demand creates more jobs, creates more demand, creates more jobs. But what are some of the real-life problems that come with stimulus?
What you've got are elections that come around too soon for an economist. You know, economic planning has got to be at the shortest 5 to 10 years. You have US elections every 4 or 5 years. So inevitably, the politicians are always thinking, are we giving individual voters enough for them to vote for us? And something that is short-term pain for long-term gain is never going down well with the voter. So there's a major cultural sea change there in America, which possibly can never happen. There's one almost psychological strain of thought that that stimulus doesn't work. Pumping money into the economy doesn't work, because even if people have more money in their pockets, they are very reluctant to spend because they know at some point taxes are going to be put up to pay for it. And it's almost like they've got wise to it, that maybe 10 years ago, when they suddenly found that they had more money and that the government was spending more money, they suddenly then experienced a few years later that actually taxes go back up to pay for it all. So individuals, again, have been, once bitten, twice shy. Just because I've got money in my pocket now, it doesn't mean that I'm always going to have it. So I'm going to keep some back in order to pay for what the government is spending on at the moment.
To get some more information about the real-world problems with stimulus and to hear an American point of view, I travelled to the capital of the United States, Washington, D.C., to talk to an associate professor of economics at the American University.
My name is Kara Reynolds. I'm an associate professor of economics at American University in Washington, D.C. So from an economic point of view, kind of Keynesian macroeconomics is a very popular viewpoint in economics, where the idea is during periods of recession, you'd want to stimulate the economy by inserting cash in some ways into the economy. That is a big problem. If you go back to Keynesian's theory, right, the idea is that when you're during periods of recession, you increase government spending, and then when you're in periods of economic growth, you then decrease government spending. And I think in general, the United States has a hard time with the decreasing, right, taking out the stimulus because of our political system, because of the way Congress is set up. It's a lot easier to start spending than it is to cut back that spending. And so then you get into these debt crises. Other than that, there may be problems with stimulus spending depending on how that money is going into the economy. And so this is where looking at more from a micro point of view can be useful. So in the United States, we had a bunch of programs at the time of the stimulus. So part of it was investment in infrastructure. A lot of road projects went on, public transportation, bridges. I think I would argue that most of those projects really needed to be done, and that's investment in the future, and that was probably really good stimulus spending in the sense that probably that investment had to be done anyway.
Republicans complain the recovery plan is too big and too slow, with spending on things that won't quickly stimulate the economy. They point to $726 million for a school snack program, $200 million to improve the Washington Mall, including planting grass, $650 million for digital TV conversion coupons, and $600 million for new cars for federal employees.
I'm concerned about the size of the package, and I'm concerned about some of the spending that's in there. How you can spend hundreds of millions of dollars on contraceptives, how does that stimulate the economy?
Yeah, so one of the other examples that I really like, the auto industry was one of the industries really hit hard too, and they kind of had their own financial crisis going on, and so one of the programs was called Cash for Clunkers, where the idea is you brought in your old car with a lot of emissions, so it has environmental benefits too. You bring it in and you get a certain amount of money off on a brand new environmentally friendly car. There was also timing issues there, right? So probably most of these cars would have eventually been traded in, and so it's just a matter of the government kind of funding personal consumption. If they were trying to fund kind of U.S. growth, there was also no caveats that had to be spent on U.S. automobiles, so actually imports almost benefited as much, if not more. Toyota, which actually a lot of their cars are produced in the United States, but other people would consider them a Japanese company, benefited probably the most out of that program. And so depending on what your goal was out of that program, you could consider it a failure as well. I guess I'll take the kind of the econ party line. I think automatic stabilizers can be very effective in stabilizing the economy. We don't have nearly as many severe recessions now as we did 100 years ago, right? So things like having unemployment benefits automatically increase, that can really improve the economy. But I think whenever you involve the political system and people picking winners and losers in terms of where that stimulus money can go into place, you can create distortions, and it is not going to be as effective.
As Dr. Reynolds states, stimulus has the potential to be very effective, but politics can hinder it. For example, the American government, culturally, finds it difficult to decrease spending again in times of prosperity, which may result in their stimulus dollars being less effective in the continuing growth programs. Now I want to briefly look back with Mr. Rhodes at how stimulus spending can be successful.
It all centres around something that every A-level economist knows, which are the components of aggregate demand. The old C plus I plus G plus X minus M, all the different things that make up demand in an economy, the G being government spending. So in a direct way, the government can influence the amount of spending and demand is in the economy because they are one of the components of it. So if a government feels that there is unemployment and standard of living is poor because spending in the economy is not enough, they, as a component of aggregate demand, can do something about it. They can increase government spending, they can give teachers a pay rise, they can give more money to the health service, they can provide a greater budget for transport or for defence. They can also at the same time cut taxes, whether that be bringing VAT back down to 12.5%, sorting out national insurance contributions, cutting income tax, raising the threshold before you start paying tax. But what that does, again, as any A-level economist will tell you, is inject funds into the economy. People who receive those funds will re-spend it in the economy. And every time this money is received and re-spent, it creates jobs. Jobs produce extra output, output creates extra income. So the amount of money flowing around the economy increases, the size of the economy increases, and hopefully unemployment comes down, economic growth restarts, a country comes out of a recession, and standard of living for all rises. That's the theory. The beauty of stimulus is, if it's successful at boosting economic growth then pays for itself, does it not? In terms of it creates more jobs and therefore more income tax. It creates more profits for companies and therefore more corporation tax. So that the key to it is getting the economy going again. And it doesn't have to be that taxes need to be higher to pay off the debt. It just needs to be that more of us are paying taxes. Not the same number of people paying more taxes, but more of us paying the same taxes. And that, for me, would be the way to cut debt over the long term.
Moving on to austerity, I asked Mr. Rhodes to tell us some more about how austerity works in theory and some of the problems we could have faced if we had chosen not to implement austerity measures to combat debt.
Quite a few themes within austerity. Basically, the starting point is that government finances are looking poor. A recession is going to mean that tax receipts are very low and unemployment pay and other social security are going to be very high. So during times of a recession, it's likely that governments are going to be experiencing fiscal deficits and that the national debt is going to be rising. And the austerity measures are designed to cut that debt as quickly as possible. Why? What's the problem with having such a big national debt? Well, number one, it needs to be serviced. You have to pay interest on it, which further cuts into your ability to spend elsewhere. Secondly, in trying to find people that will lend to you to cover the debt is inevitably going to lead to interest rates becoming higher. If you're scrabbling around trying to find new people to borrow from, then interest rates are going to be higher, and higher interest rates in an economy is never a good thing. Third reason why having poor government finances is a problem is that the financial markets tend to get very jittery. They tend to lose confidence if there is government problems in terms of debt. They like it when governments control and cut debt. That sends a message of confidence from them. Alongside that, you have the supply side economists who generally feel that the best way to organise an economy is through the free market. And if it's the free market controlling resources and allocating scarce resources into different products, it therefore isn't going to be the government. So if the government's taking a step back, that inevitably is going to lead to less government spending and cutting budgets. You get to the stage that Greece almost got to, where you have the possibility of a government, of a public sector defaulting. And economists around the world all looked at each other and said, well, what's going to happen? Well, we don't know. It's the unthinkable. You know, that halfway through Tuesday afternoon, teachers' wages will run out. That when I go to pick up my pension, there isn't any money for it. That when a teacher in a school puts in an order for textbooks, there's no money for textbooks. If the government runs out of money, where on earth does an economy go? So the austerity people would say controlling government debt is massively important. It's psychological to the financial markets. It's hugely in terms of gaining confidence in the world economy. It's unsustainable to keep spending money that you don't have, and that the alternative of stimulus doesn't work.
It's become clear as I progressed through the making of this film that the decision of austerity or stimulus is not only based on economics. Different countries are in different situations and have different economic and cultural factors that could affect the decision. I arranged an interview with my local MP, John Barron, to discuss some of the factors affecting the decisions made by the UK and the US.
In 2010, when the Conservatives came into power, there was a big mountain to climb, and that mountain was debt. The previous government, in 5 years, had added more debt to the country than all the previous governments combined in the previous 300. In other words, they more than doubled the national debt. Now, there comes a point where actually you can only take on so much debt. And as we've seen with the countries in southern Europe, the markets begin to question your ability to pay down debt or pay that debt back. And when they start doing that, interest rates rise. Not your own central bank imposed interest rates, but the interest rates in the market rise. And what you see now, or have seen, is massive interest in with regards to the Eurozone countries, some of them. You've seen massive unemployment. Youth unemployment is nearly 50% in certain countries, in Spain, Italy, Greece, and a number of others. And if the markets lose confidence, then that is the sort of thing that can happen, because businesses don't want to invest. Inward investment dries up. businesses go out of business because interest rates have risen so much. And so you've got to make sure you bear down on that debt. Otherwise, as I say, if the markets lose confidence and interest rates rise, then it can have very, very negative impacts on your own economy. What people perhaps don't realise is it's been perhaps a little less austere than people realise. You will hear the government say that we've reduced the deficit by a third. Now that sounds very impressive, but actually it means that we're still adding to the debt, but at 2/3 the rate previously. It's not as though we're paying down the debt. You know, it's going to take a long haul, this. We are still borrowing more than we are generating as a country. All the Conservatives have done is slow down the adding of that debt. So we've got to be careful when we talk about austerity, because government expenditure is still going up. It's not as though we've slashed it. Certain budgets have had to be slashed, yes. I have a particular interest in the army. I'm ex-military. You know, the British Army, the infantry, has been cut by 20%. But certain other budgets have been allowed to keep up with inflation. For example, the NHS, which is a massive budget, approaching £120 billion. The international aid budget. Our EU contributions haven't hardly been touched. So overall, we're still adding to the debt, but what we're trying to do is slow down the speed, if you like, at which we're adding to that debt, and hopefully eventually balance the books. But let's be clear, no, I don't think there is a fundamental difference between the parties in Parliament about the need to cut down the debt, because I think there's a general acceptance that we went too far, or we're close to getting too far, and we've seen what happens in other countries when they cross that Rubicon and the markets lose faith. You know, business confidence dries up, economic growth dries up, unemployment rises as interest rates rise, because the market loses confidence in a country's ability to pay down that debt. And as we've seen on the continent, and certainly in the southern Mediterranean countries, you know, unemployment is terribly high. And that's what you do not want that for your own people. Well, for me, unemployment is one of the biggest social evils in society, because so much badness can stem from it. You know, the state is there to try and provide full employment. It may not always succeed at full employment, but it's to try to get the unemployment rate down, but also to provide a safety net for those that are truly vulnerable in society. And if it fails in that, then it is in trouble and it is failing in its duty. So that's why we have a situation now, I'm pleased to say, and as you well know, I've sometimes been very critical of my government, but when it comes to the economy, I think broadly they've got it right. And that is, we have a situation where economic growth is faster than the Eurozone or EU average. Unemployment is well below the EU average. The finances are coming under control slowly, again, in contrast to many Eurozone countries. And we're in a far better economic position than many on the continent. America is in a slightly unique position because it is seen as the, if you like, you know, it is the backstop to the economic system, the strength of the American financial system. Therefore, it has more leeway. The markets give it more leeway when it comes to borrowing. Now, I'm not saying that that is unlimited, but there is more tolerance, more forgiveness in the system when it comes to America, because it is seen as the financial backstop to the economic system generally. And if America fails, then we all go swimming down the Swanee, so to speak. So I would suggest America is a slightly special situation. It has more scope to borrow because basically it is the bedrock of the economic and financial system. Britain used to be, you know, go back to the 19th century. America has taken on that role today, and that's not demeaning the importance of the Bank of England or the British economy. You know, we sit in the fourth or fifth largest economy in the world. Given the size of the island, we've got a lot to be proud of. I mean, we have a bigger economy than Russia, for example. So, you know, we're not has-beens or losers, but you have to recognise that America is big. It's got the big corporations. It is the bedrock, as I say, of the financial and economic system. So it's given more leeway by the markets to borrow. So they're in a slightly different position, whereas the markets have clearly asked questions of certain countries on the continent, for example, And they have been found wanting, which is why interest rates have gone shooting up, the economy stalled, and unemployment has gone up as well.
In my opinion, based on speaking to the experts in these interviews, both the UK and the USA governments made the correct decisions for their country and, in the end, the world economy. The UK had little choice in how to act after the masses of debt it had accumulated in the years prior to the crunch. Austerity measures had to be put in place to tackle debt. Also, although it looks good on paper and may have also been successful, implementing stimulus measures ran the risk of leading us into a debt crisis similar to that suffered in other European partner countries, such as Greece or Spain. The USA is a bigger country than the UK, with a different culture. It is the American way to spend your way out of trouble. It is the country of going big, and the American people wouldn't have been accepting of austerity measures. The world economy was relying on America to lead the way out of the recession, and as one of the world's biggest consumers, if they didn't spend, the lack of demand would have been crippling worldwide. However, now, both countries are leading the way out of the recession and have been successful so far in their efforts. I'll leave you with the final thoughts of my interviewees, based only on economic theory.
Personally, I would definitely still engage in stimulus. I don't know that I would choose the form that it took in this country, right? But that I think some form of government intervention, cash interjection in the economy actually did reduce the severity of the recession.
Broadly speaking, I think the UK has made the right decision in trying to par down the rate at which we add to our debt. It's got to be a reasonably gradual process, but we've got to get to grips with it all the same, because you cannot go on living beyond the means.
So if I was forced to nail my colours to the mast in terms of would I go for austerity or would I go for stimulus, I would say that as an economist, I'm very much about creating the most welfare for people from the scarce resources that we have on this planet. So therefore, for me, if it's all about the welfare that people are experiencing or not experiencing, for me, austerity would always be too severe. So I would be a stimulus man through and through.